to talk a little bit about superheat and subcool.
When I was in school and first heard the terms superheat and subcool, I heard superheat and I was like, ooh, superheat, that must be hot. Ooh, it must be super hot. I'm scared to touch it. It's superheat. Superheat. And it's got to be hot. So I don't want to touch it. And then I thought of subcool and I was like, ooh, that sounds really cold. It sounds like below freezing cold. But I was wrong. If you think about it, and when you touch it, and when you're thinking about where it comes from, superheat, when you feel it, it's in the suction line. The suction line is cold. And subcool is actually pretty warm. So when you're feeling subcooling, you're feeling medium temperature, high pressure liquid coming out of the condenser coil. That's your subcool. And the subcool feels much, much warmer than the superheat. But when I first heard those terms, I was just like, ooh, superheat, that's super hot. And subcool, ooh, very, very cold. But the opposite is true. So that's something to keep in mind. Your superheat feels cold because it's in the suction line and it's low temperature vapor refrigerant. And your subcool feels warm because it's medium temperature, high pressure liquid refrigerant. So that's something to keep in mind.
As you can see, we are at my questionably installed train unit at my rental house. So if you wonder why I haven't made improvements to this, that's why. It's not mine. But as you can see, we've got our air handler. It's an upright in the garage. We've got our line set, suction line, liquid line. So refrigerant flows, liquid refrigerant, through the liquid line this way to the metering device, and from the evaporator coil through the suction line this way back to the compressor. This is the air handler. It's an upright in the garage. We're going to pull this off. We'll talk about superheat, the change of state in the refrigerant, latent heat, and sensible heat. So obviously this is the evaporator coil in the unit in my house, and the way this works is the liquid refrigerant goes through the metering device, drops from a high pressure to a low pressure with a little bit of flash gas. It then gets distributed into the coil. If you think about it as a state change, it goes in as a mostly liquid and it starts running through these coils, making a trip. As it's doing that, warm air is being pulled across it from the house. As it picks up heat, it boils. The liquid refrigerant boils. It changes state and it is saturated. When liquid and vapor are present at the same time, it is saturated. So it goes from a liquid to saturated to fully vapor. It changes state from liquid to vapor. And then in the middle, that's saturated. After it boils off and turns completely into a vapor, it distributes back into the suction line and goes back to the compressor. This is coming from the compressor, from the condenser, and this is going to the compressor. It's coming in as a liquid, it's leaving as a low pressure vapor, a low pressure superheated vapor. And what does that mean? Superheat is the heat that it picks up after it turns into a vapor. Everything before that is latent heat. It picks up latent heat. It's still picking up heat energy, and that's what changes the state. As it changes state, it starts picking up sensible heat. So latent heat changes the state, not the temperature. Sensible heat changes the temperature, not the state. Again, it picks up heat, but it doesn't change temperature. It changes state. That is latent heat. It is taking latent heat out of the air. It changes state, and then it picks up sensible heat. For example, if the saturation temperature in this coil is 45 degrees, it changes into a vapor at 45 degrees, and then it continues through the coil picking up more heat, more heat, more heat as a vapor, and it comes out at 55 degrees, then what we have is 10 degrees of superheat. It's weird because superheat, it still feels cold. So at this point, we are low temperature, low pressure, superheated vapor refrigerant. 100% vapor coming out of the evaporator coil, going into the suction line, and making its journey back to the condenser through the line set. So this is the condenser. As you can see, we've got condensate dripping, condensate lines clear. That's not what we're talking about today. This is the liquid line. This is the suction line. And as you can see, it is insulated all the way through. So realistically, there shouldn't be much temperature change from the air handler to right here. Right here is where most people will measure the superheat and the subcool. They'll usually clamp up right here because the pressure probes go right here, and it's all just one shot. You can sometimes expect 1 or 2 degrees, depending on the length of line set, of a difference between here and the air handler, but we take that into account. So here's your condenser coil. What happens in the condenser coil? The condenser coil is where we get subcooling, and it does the opposite of the evaporator coil in a lot of ways. Vapor refrigerant comes back through here, goes to the compressor, gets compressed into high pressure vapor. As it goes through the condenser coil on its little journey, see how dirty it is? That's nice. It goes through the condenser coil, and the whole time this big fan is pulling air across it. The air out here is cooler than the refrigerant, so it takes the heat with it. It rejects the heat, and we're looking for another state change. As it goes through here, as a high temperature, high pressure vapor, it starts cooling off, cooling off, cooling off, and when it's cooling off, it reaches a saturation temperature. Saturation, again, in simple terms, is usually around the middle, or should be around the middle of the coil, if the right amount of refrigerant's in there. So we have vapor, saturation, and then at the bottom we have full liquid. So as it runs through here, it changes state, it cools off, it changes state back into a liquid from a vapor, still high pressure the whole way through, but it turns into a liquid and it starts stacking up a little bit. Full liquid doesn't really stack up, but that's what we call it. And it should be full liquid right in here. Well, it's still running through the coil and it's still rejecting heat. So what if this turns into, what if it changes state? What if it's saturated at 100 degrees? And it's coming out of the condenser coil as a liquid, a high pressure liquid, at 90 degrees. That means that after it turns into a liquid, it's rejecting more heat, and however much sensible heat it rejects after it turns into a liquid is your subcool. If you feel it, it's warm. It doesn't feel subcool at all, but it is. It means how much heat energy it rejected after turning into a liquid. So if it comes out at 90, saturation is 100, you have 10 degrees of subcool. Pretty sort of simple, right?
So right here, it's important to make a couple of distinctions on what you just saw. If we're talking about the condenser coil and that liquid refrigerant is stacking up at the bottom, think about what might happen if there's not enough refrigerant in the system. So if you've got a low charge, there's not enough refrigerant in the system, then the refrigerant is not stacking up as a liquid on the bottom of that coil, right? So what happens is the longer the liquid refrigerant is moving through that coil, the more heat it rejects and the more subcool you have. What happens if I get to a call and I'm working on a unit that has 2 degrees of subcool? Well, that means that it's not turning into a liquid and staying as a liquid in the coil for enough time to reject that extra heat. So with the TXV in the system, which is the metering device, it tells us that if there's a low subcool, that means that there's probably not enough refrigerant in the system. There's a good chance. There's a couple other things that could be wrong with it, but in general, if everything else is working the right way, that's a pretty good indicator that it's a low charge situation and it might do better with some added refrigerant. Now, a low subcool, if it actually is a low refrigerant situation, is typically accompanied by a higher superheat. And a basic rule of thumb, and of course, check the manufacturer specifications, but a basic rule of thumb that we go with in Phoenix is 10 and 10. We're looking for about 10 degrees of superheat, about 10 degrees of subcooling, plus or minus 2. So I know some people will disagree with that, but that's kind of what we typically shoot for, again, as a rule of thumb. So if I have a unit that's got 2 degrees of subcool accompanied by 25 degrees of superheat, that tells me that number one, there's not enough liquid refrigerant stacking up in the condenser, and number two, that it has a starved evaporator coil. Because remember, the evaporator coil is where we get our superheat. And if you think about how that operates, if I have a starved evaporator coil, that means I'm not getting enough refrigerant to it. So if I've got low refrigerant or I'm not getting a solid column of liquid refrigerant to that metering device, and it vaporizes or boils off in the evaporator coil too early, that means it's got all that travel time through that evaporator coil to pick up sensible heat. So the more sensible heat it picks up, the less refrigerant it has. So if it's feeding the proper amount of refrigerant to it, it should come out with roughly 10 degrees of superheat. That's what we like to see because the superheat protects the compressor from getting any liquid refrigerant back to it. So we like to see some superheat, but we don't like to see too much because that means not enough liquid refrigerant or not enough of a solid column of liquid refrigerant is making it to the evaporator. So we have a starved evaporator, too much superheat, low subcool in the condenser, and those two situations together tell us that there's a pretty good chance that it is a low refrigerant situation.
In the terms of cycle of life, if we think about it starting from the compressor, you can see down there we've got our suction line and our discharge line. The line on the bottom, the bigger line, is the suction line. That's the vapor refrigerant going to the compressor, low pressure. And on the top of the compressor we have the discharge line, which is the high temperature, high pressure vapor refrigerant coming out of the compressor. From there, it goes into the condenser coil. It runs through the condenser coil, rejects heat, saturated, subcools, and then it runs out back to the air handler through the liquid line, going to the metering device. When it makes its way to the other end of the line set, it is a high pressure liquid refrigerant, and then it goes right into the metering device. This metering device is a TXV. It goes through here, and what happens in the metering device? The pressure drops. Bleh. Low pressure. High pressure going in, low pressure, mostly liquid refrigerant coming out. There's a little bit of flash gas. The pressure drop causes a little bit of that refrigerant to flash off and start the boiling process. It's then fed into the evaporator coil, where it picks up the heat from the air moving across it. It picks up heat, picks up latent heat, picks up latent heat, and then it changes state. Saturated. Liquid and vapor are present at the same time. It picks up more heat, completely boils off, and after it boils off, it starts picking up sensible heat. So if your saturation temperature is 45, and it picks up 5 degrees more of sensible heat, by the time it comes out of the evaporator coil, then that's 5 degrees of superheat. Superheat is how much heat energy, how much sensible heat it picks up after it changes state.
This is a really basic first look at latent heat, sensible heat, Superheat and Subcool. So I wanted to show it to you on a real system so you can kind of see what happens where, get a little bit better grip on how the different states interact throughout the system. And there are several, probably thousand channels out there that have a lot more resources, and they are going to explain it a lot better. Some really good ones to check out because they have good graphics and can go a little more in depth about explaining this. I would recommend Ty Branneman, um, or Love to HVAC, LOVE, and the number 2 HVAC. Same guy. I've seen videos under his name on Facebook, and it looks like on YouTube he mostly does Love to HVAC. That is a really good guy for technical stuff. Another one is AC Service Tech LLC. He does a really good job of explaining things, and HVAC School. It's the guys at Kalos. I think they're in Florida. They have a little bit different climate than we do, but their videos are really great. They have really great graphics, and they do a really good job of further explaining the subjects that I've touched on. So hopefully this helped. Hopefully you understand a little bit better about scratching the surface on some of this stuff. Like I said, this video is basically meant for my class, which is entry level. And if you're an expert and you already know stuff, I probably don't have a whole lot to tell you. Basically, this is scratching the surface. The guys that I mentioned, the channels that I mentioned, do a much better job of getting into depth about this stuff. So be sure to check them out.